All right, welcome. This is the Something Ventured podcast. I am Kent Lindstrom. I am your host. My guest today, Peter Berger. It is Peter, not Pete, right?
Honestly, I go by both. Mostly it has to do with the person who's calling me a name and whether or not I like them, and it's Peter or Pete. I like you, so you can just call me whatever you want.
If you don't like them, you correct them.
Yeah,
correct them to the other one.
It's Mr. Berger.
Yeah, exactly. Welcome. How you doing?
I'm doing well. It's you can't when you live in San Francisco, it's really difficult to complain.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, it's easy for many, but it shouldn't be.
So I was writing down. I was going to try to introduce you and introduce your company. I'm like, why the hell should I do all the work? Why don't you introduce yourself and your company, and then we'll start chatting. And
all right, we'll introduce me and my company. Although the conversation may divert far away from that.
Yeah.
So I am one of the co-founders and CEO of Contact IQ. Contact IQ is an intelligent, centralized Rolodex for sales and business development organizations. We take all the connections and contacts for your entire company, put them in one searchable database. What does this mean in reality? Well, about 36.5% of all your connections are on LinkedIn. If you do some serious sales, that number drops below 10%. So there's a 90% gap in what you actually know about your network. We pull from email, your CRM, and all these other different marketing sources so that you have an intelligent, comprehensive understanding of all your connections and contacts to strategically sell into any organization.
That's like our ad. Instead of doing a MailChimp ad at the beginning, we'll just do an ad for your company.
Yeah, I have to tell you, MailChimp's going to pay you more.
Do you ever? That's true. Do you ever listen to the Tim Ferriss podcast?
I do. I actually enjoy it quite a bit.
It's a fabulous. It's a great podcast. Although he, I was like, there's a Jamie Foxx one that he did.
Oh yeah, the 3 hour one.
Yeah, it's like 2 hours 40 minutes. I'm like, I want to hear Jamie Foxx. I want to hear Tim Ferriss. 2 hours 40 minutes. That's just crazy.
Well, it's sort of like the Hateful Eight of podcasts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's amazing. And so at the same point, we're joking about MailChimp. My God, that guy, I'm 5 minutes in before the guy starts with his, by the time he's sold this thing and sold me that thing and sold me the other thing. I'm like, good Lord.
Got to pay the bills.
You do have to pay the bills. Although I think podcasting is going to catch up with this because TV and radio have figured out what a 30-second spot is. I get that it's what the client wants, but 2.5 minutes on Wealthfront, I'm like, that's it's a long form ad when everybody has a forward by 15-second button on their thing.
Right, and although you can look at some aspects of radio and see an analog in podcasting, and if you do an advertisement well, if it's a fun narrative, it ends up being interesting. I know Howard Stern has done some really great stuff in regards to these long form advertisings. But I do agree that there are certain podcasters, I'm not calling out Mr. Ferriss in particular, that tend to drone. And it doesn't really add a lot of value.
Yeah. That's exactly right. And there's one podcast, I talk about long podcasts. You get it right. There's a podcast called Hardcore History.
Yeah, I love Hardcore History. Dan Carlin's excellent.
Yeah, Dan Carlin. So I'm like, I'm not going to listen to that because, I looked at one of them, it's 3 hours, and that was part 1 of 4. So these holidays, I was in my car driving somewhere, and I start listening to it. I'm like, yep, 8 hours, fabulous podcast. That guy is just, I don't really know how he does it. He's he was a radio guy, he was a journalist, but if you haven't heard the podcast, it's this really deep dive into this part, into a part of history, the Mongols or something like that. And it's incredible.
And the 8-hour podcast you're referring to is Dan Carlin's Wrath of the Cons.
Yeah, Wrath of the Cons.
And it is superlative in its scope and research. Basically, he spends months and months and months working on something. He also has another podcast that's more about politics. I forget the name of it, but it tends to be a little more offhanded and not intensely researched. But his intentionally, I appreciate people that put together long-form podcasts because it's a bloody audiobook when you get down to it. It's a nice audiobook with no text.
Yeah, it's just that he produces them with some frequency. And then at the end of the podcast, he ruminates. I listened to one where at the end of the podcast, he's like, yeah, it wasn't that good. Oh, I know. It was about Martin Luther.
Yes.
And at the end of it, he's like, I don't know. And it was fantastic, by the way. But at the end of it, he kind of comes out and says something he just ruminates on the podcast. He's like, I got to do better next time.
Right. And I think this was Martin Luther, the Reformation, and the siege at Augsburg.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Wow. That sounds good. Podcast. Yeah.
Yeah. No, like I said, his stuff sticks with me.
And I think his theme in that was largely, if you look back, it was, we'll get to Silicon Valley in a second, but what the hell? It's my podcast. We can talk about whatever we want.
Exactly.
He was talking about this guy would So it was when Martin Luther said, "Hey, here's the everybody can read the Bible, not just the priests." And the
Correct.
priests were like, "Fuck, that sucks. We can." And everybody who read the Bible, these poor people were like, Jesus looks an awful lot like the kind of guy who might want to hang out with a poor person. And,
Yes.
and the priests were like, no, Jesus wants you to be poor, and like whatever the hell he was saying. But the guy who takes over this town is this guy who talks to, has these off the record conversations with God and comes back and goes, God wants you to like give me your wife and like that kind of stuff.
No, full on sort of Branch Davidian cult type stuff.
Yeah, right. And his point was a lot of people in history who were faith leaders and things like that are what we would call insane, like schizophrenic people.
Oh yeah, there's a big argument to be made that people that had why aren't so many people having visions nowadays, and sort of God speaking to them is. Back then, the only sort of context for your lunacy was biblical. That was your fantasy life. There were either wizards or witches from the old traditions or religion.
Yeah.
And so if you had mental instability, you're going to go in that general direction. That is going to be your narrative.
Yeah.
So that's the tools you have. And now you have this broad narrative where you could pretend you're Kim Kardashian's sister and whatever, or you have Michael Jackson's baby.
Well, I also got the sense too that a lot of it was obviously no internet, the printing press is just coming around. A lot of it was sort of your ability to persuade a crowd.
Oh yeah.
So when this guy would stand up in front of everybody, and this one guy in particular talked about would wear certain outfits, like he had a beautiful wife who would wear white and he would wear black, and he looked really weird. Like a lot of people, when they're like, God, it's weird. I just talked to God. He said you need to give me your money. A lot of people were like, really? You sure? But mob mentality, the ability to persuade a crowd. So there are a lot of people, I think, with some theatrical skills who were, making things. It's probably true to this day, basically.
Well, really, it's all. When it comes down to it, it's marketing, right? Mm-hmm. It's all about marketing.
Yeah.
And back then, marketing was just a little less complex. Oration was the top of the line. Yeah. Because you had no mass media. Even in sort of American presidential elections, at the turn of the last century, public oration, getting up and speaking with or without a microphone was a big deal. And in fact, there was a documentary by Ken Burns about the Roosevelts and about FDR. And the fact that FDR could do fireside chats, he did about a dozen of them as opposed to every week, like some presidents have since. His fireside chats allowed him to speak in a very conversational voice when most politicians had to essentially scream because it was unamplified to crowds. And so political speech was very different. It was almost sort of public yelling as opposed to this calming fireside chat that he had with the American people. Yeah. And it had a remarkable impact.
Yeah. Well, if you go way back in history, I want to get us as far off track as we can.
Exactly.
And then we're going to come back.
Sure.
And we're going to talk about Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley versus Wall Street is one of the topics I wanted to talk about. Since the stock market's been trying to implode lately, I thought we'd make some comparisons there.
Mild correction.
But way back in the Shakespearean theater, people today sit in theaters and they kind of watch, like, that's good, shh, be quiet. The actors on stage were competing with an audience that was drinking, partying, yelling at each other. And so in order to get their attention, you had to put on a crazy show. Like people had to be killing and having sex with each other and had to be complicated. That's actually how the theater used to work. So there is a tradition of, get up there and figure out how to persuade people no matter what, and you win.
There's a big argument that Shakespeare was the Michael Bay of his era. That you want to go in there, it's like, well, I don't have the CGI to do transforming robots, but let's have a lot of murder and incest. What do we say, gang?
Yeah, exactly. Well, and you look at the the beginning of Richard III, like now is the reason the play starts with the word now is he's basically yelling at everybody in the audience, going, nah, like listen, like stop. And they were drinking, partying. There was no like shushing and turn off your cell phones, well, for the obvious reason.
Yeah. Well, it was a little more. Socratic discourse.
Yeah.
There was a lot more audience theater interaction. I think what happened is that there's sort of the pit and the other part, which I always forget the name of, that the aristocratic part of theater is the only thing that really remains. There's no sort of, common people, this is what we're doing for the day because everybody's home watching the NFL.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so we turn to Silicon Valley.
Yes.
But what the heck? We had an interesting conversation about Silicon Valley versus Wall Street. and kind of what the culture is.
Sure.
And in the sense, I've talked a lot on this podcast with different people, partially because I've talked to Hollywood people and people in Silicon Valley, about this being an industry town, like physically an industry town. And if you want to go back in history, who is it? James Currier, kind of the great entrepreneur in Silicon Valley, is like, back in the day, like when Rome was the center of things,
yes,
you went to Rome. Like you didn't go to Dublin or the outskirts of Rome. Like if Rome was the center, you went to Rome if you want to make things happen. In finance, you go to, the hedge funds are largely in New York and Greenwich, Connecticut, Tokyo, whatever. Silicon Valley is largely here, and Hollywood is in Los Angeles. Like,
yes.
That's where you go. If you want to be an actress, you don't go, I'm gonna move to whatever, Miami, and see what I can. I mean, maybe a model or something in Miami. And this is an industry town, but we're kind of contrasting a little bit. One of the things that characterizes Silicon Valley that I think might characterize Hollywood, but not Wall Street, is it is a networking town.
Yeah, I would 100% agree with that. I would also state that, so I grew up in the Bay Area. Yeah. So I grew up down in Redwood City, went to school here, went to California Polytechnic, then moved to the East Coast for graduate school, and then worked there after graduate school. So I have a bit of sort of bi-coastal perspective. And when I came back in 2003, things were very different. And I think that over the decade plus that I've been back, one of the things I have noticed is the industry-ness of the town is increasing, and the who is the most important thing is increasing dramatically, because I've seen successes purely based on the social pressure that the person's network can kind of put on the rest of the network to facilitate success.
Yeah.
And this goes for getting people to work for them. This goes for getting initial funding. This goes for getting additional funding. And this goes for getting acquired when things haven't worked out particularly well, that sort of thing. And the repetition that this network is willing to put into each other, that they don't sort of get new bodies in there saying, oh, okay, well, this didn't really work out. Let's look for another person. They're like, well, this person's getting more seasoned.
Yeah.
3 or 4 failures into it, they're ripe. This steak has been aging for a quality amount of time. This is a time to strike.
Well, to go really deep on the contrast, if you take Steve Jobs, who's generally not an example of anything when people try to compare themselves, but if you look at Steve Jobs, working in the garage on his computer, like, people worked in this sort of nerd, like really technical obscurity for a long time to create something big. Now, if there's a hint that you might be that guy, you're invited to this cocktail party and that cocktail party, and you got to meet my partner Bob. And it's this very odd sort of. I mean, maybe Mark Zuckerberg was one of the first or one of the last where he was working in a little bit of obscurity in his dorm at Harvard for a little while. And then when he got out here, he wasn't an obvious investment, even though he was, the beautiful prototype of the kid working in a hacker house.
By the way, he is the prototype now.
Yeah. Oh,
he wasn't the prototype then.
Well, I guess that's right.
Right. That's how prototypes work. I think that there's a lot of the challenge we have, and I think this is for any industry town, is the echo chamber. And you end up, that's why you see a lot of movies that are much more formulaic. That's why you see a lot of companies that tend to be pretty formulaic, because we're allegedly dealing in a creative industry with potentially a lack of creative people.
Right. Well, I think Hollywood's a little more honest about that, right? Everyone's like, well, why the hell are they making, whatever the Penguin Karate freaking movie is 3? It's like, what? They know why they're making it. Like, it makes money. Like, they spend $80 million and it brings in $190 million. And
exactly.
That's great. And employs a whole ton of people. I heard the one that drives me nuts is, so just think about this compared to an actual like creative process, is everyone's in Davos right now, which is when everyone super ironically flies to Davos on their private jets to complain about the environment. Yeah, about the one guy who doesn't believe in climate change or whatever they complain about. And you see people on Facebook like, great conversation about the future of technology and what it's going to mean for us. I'm like, was Steve Jobs really sitting around in his garage, like going, technology, the future of technology is going to be, no, he was like, shit, this capacitor doesn't tie to this other thing that.
Well, to be fair, most of that was Wozniak. Jobs was the one who sort of said, "Hey, Woz, this seems pretty interesting. Do you want to make it a product?" And then Wozniak, to his credit, went back to, I believe, Hewlett Packard, and said, "Hey, I invented this kind of on your dime." And Hewlett Packard said, "This is not going to be a thing.
Yeah.
Go get him, Tiger."
Yeah.
And there comes Apple. And I think Jobs had a knack for management. Now, I wouldn't say it's a replicable knack. I wouldn't say you would write a book on it and teach it at Harvard Business School, but it worked for him.
Yeah.
And he was very fortunate to partner up early on with some legitimate technical people that could get it done.
Yeah.
And then fortunately got later on some very legitimate design people to help him get to where it is. And then it was all management and marketing.
Yeah. So is it all a hustle in Silicon Valley? I mean,
it is all a hustle.
I mean, you look at, these things about the future of technology. What's funny about it is there's literally, in contrast to Wall Street, there's almost no cost, right? Like if I go, oh, here's what's going to happen in 7 years, this car is going to be driverless and all that, as opposed to at least a trader in Silicon Valley who's like, oh, what's going to happen tomorrow is, the yen's going to decline against the dollar. You make the bet, you lose $1 million. You're like, maybe not.
Well, but I would argue that Wall Street has created an environment where they're almost in a no-lose situation. Yeah. That Wall Street is essentially... So there's two arguments about finance in general. The proper sort of informed market component is that what the financial industry does is effectively allocate capital to where it's most needed and where it's going to provide the most benefit.
Yeah.
And that efficiency comes from a lot of intense competition to put things in the proper places.
Yeah.
That's why stocks go up and stocks go down. And these minor corrections on a day-to-day basis are just the inefficiencies in the market because information is limited. Then there's the other component, which is becoming more prevalent, to be really frank, at least in the popular mindset from my point of view, that it's essentially a tax on the economy. That you have financial instruments that include additional complexity for no additional benefit, only for the fact that you're limiting the amount of people who can interact with it. Bundled derivatives, things along those lines. And don't even get me started on high-speed trading, which essentially is a mechanical tax on everyone, so that if I'm sitting at my computer and I am using E-Trade and I'm doing large enough trades that it'll move something, that when I punch the number in, the number is going to move, and that's because there's a system that's directly attached to every exchange at this point that sees my move, is done a little pre-buy, and then bumps the price. So they're essentially taxing me a certain amount just for being in the system because they have the advantage of being physically closer, and they can, the physics works in their benefit because of the speed of light and such. So those are the two components that you have to balance. It's efficiency in the system and essentially people creating complexity in order to tax the system and just essentially take a rip off a transaction for no benefit other than themselves.
Yeah, there's a fabulous the book Flash Boys. Have you heard this by Michael Lewis, who's the guy who wrote the book, that the movie The Big Short.
Big Short, Moneyball. I mean, he writes some good stuff, and he spent some serious time in researching.
Married to Tabitha Soren, by the way. Did you know that? Do you know who the
No
MTV,
kidding.
The MTV like VJ. Okay, for those of you under 30, there used to be a thing called MTV, and they used to have a thing called VJs.
And they used to have a thing called music?
Yeah, exactly. And they had these VJs at the beginning, which was video DJs, and they were kind of like a little more cerebral than what you would expect for just like a TV announcer. They were supposed to be music nerds. And Tabitha Soren was one of them.
She was also MTV News.
Right, she did MTV News.
She did MTV News. So she wasn't officially a VJ. She was MTV News, which was a bit odd because they just didn't cover entertainment news. They covered news.
Yeah, like they do politics, like Bill Clinton's doing.
Yeah, well, that was the Rock the Vote. Rock the Vote era.
Stuff. Yeah. Anyway, shockingly, he lives over. It's either in Berkeley or Piedmont. Michael Lewis does.
Sure.
It is not. He wouldn't be married to Tabitha Soren, but he's married to Tabitha Soren and has a couple kids of all things. But I think every time I hear him talk, he's just like he's this guy who went to Princeton and then worked at like Bear Stearns or one of them, Lehman Brothers or something. So really kind of learned finance, but just happens to be a fabulous writer.
Yes.
And his Flash Boys is, I think, the one that's about the guys who figured out basically the physical structure of the internet to make to have a trading advantage.
So what happened? The Flash Boys. I read the book over the summer. The main premise is that there was a group of people in the Bank of Canada Bank of Canada decided to be a player in Wall Street because they were missing all this money.
It's called the RBC, Royal Bank of Canada, and a guy from RBC figures this thing out.
He figures this thing out, and what he realizes is billions of dollars are essentially being taxed off the system, and how does RBC build a system to counteract that and then sell it and get a strategic advantage? And it's an interesting ongoing struggle that they have, and I'm unclear the position that they are in currently. I'm not even quite sure the program really exists or these people are at RBC anymore because they were setting up their own exchange at the very end.
Right. Well, yeah, my understanding, and so I did a podcast on a book called Tubes. Have you heard about this book?
No, I haven't.
It's basically this guy who a reporter sets out to figure out the physical structure of the internet.
Okay.
Like literally, and he learned like the boxes, the warehouses that the servers are in, like where the servers literally,
where are the nodes?
Yeah, well, and the fiber optic cable literally goes into the dirt at some point. Like stuff like there's a building in New York that like 80% of the world's traffic flows under or something like that, and Google bought this building. It's like this random building. It's stuff like that.
Oh, fun.
And the joke is there was the guy who said the internet is a series of tubes. I think it was the
that was Strom Thurmond, I think.
Was it?
It was Strom Thurmond,
I thought it was the Alaska guy, Ted, whatever the hell his name is.
Yeah, the guy who went to jail.
Yeah. In any case, this guy goes, you know what's funny? The internet actually is a series of tubes. It's a series of fiber optic cables carrying light around. But I think the conclusion of the Flash Boys thing was that Wall Street now, so everybody was renting this one server space at this one co-location facility that was right across the street from the NASDAQ.
Correct.
And so now I think what they make you do is like you have to put in like 500 feet of cable even if you're right next to the server.
Something along those lines. But also there's been a diversification of exchanges. So I believe there's at least a dozen or more exchanges now, so that if, let's say, NASDAQ goes down, there's additional trading that can happen even on the stocks that are traded on the NASDAQ.
Yeah.
And then there's this whole thing called dark pools and things like that, which are internal trading groups that were run by Credit Suisse and things like that.
Yeah. It's actually quite cool, or quite interesting.
It is, but just sort of getting back to the point, what's happening with the financial industry is, in order for trade guilds to protect their industry, you create artificial complexity.
Right.
Whether it's the legal guild, which uses a lot of Latin, and this whole sort of intellectual construct that is difficult for people that haven't gone through law school to really fathom. All finances is truly, when it comes down to it, math and a little bit of logic. But when you have different licensings, when you have ways of restricting people access to these different financial pools, that creates a need for you as an industry. Right. Essentially, there's an artificial need created, and then there's a have and a have-not group. Right. And that's what the finance industry has really done. It's not a democratization. There's just tiered. Yeah. That they have the random 401k E-Trade group, which does not benefit at all other than random luck and general growth that is hopefully faster than inflation. And then you have everybody else who are larger players who can buy a seat closer at the table that have much, much larger advantages in the market than regular people would.
What do you think goes on in the community of Wall Street compared to Silicon Valley? I mean, here people are just crazy networkers. I mean, Reid Hoffman's probably one of the wealthiest guys. I don't know if it's correlated or not, but he, famously takes 14 meetings a day, and then on Saturdays, when you're having coffee, it's to organize your time to talk about how you're going to do X, Y, Z. Mm-hmm. Like, is that going on Wall Street, or are people just trying to screw each other and whoever is making the most money gets hired?
I think that Wall Street is much more systematic than Silicon Valley. I think the necessity for networking in Silicon Valley focuses very heavily on you're getting into a system that has no structure. That did you drop out of high school? Did you drop out of college? Did you do this? Did you do this? And you associate yourself with the sanguine group you can get closest to most quickly. If you're a British immigrant, then you're hanging out with a lot of Brits, and you sort of go through those channels. If you're from an Ivy League school, then you're trying to sort of work that angle. And you have to network your way in. With finance, it's I went to X school and I got X grades. I did this internship and I'm working my way up. Now, of course, you're dealing with a lot of people within your same cohort as you're evolving in your career. But it's a different type of networking that your job is sometimes based on performance, but a lot of times based on sort of past achievement.
Yeah.
How well did you do in your SATs? What school did you go to? How good were your grades in that school? Then where did you get your internship? Did you perform mildly well in that internship, or at least you could be the top fish, or you are you the top fish, a total failure, or you're just in the middle like everybody else? And even in the middle like everyone else, you're performing quite well compared to everyone else in the entire world.
Yeah. And what do you think the pull is on like a young person looking out from a university that's not Stanford, your Duke or something like that, and you kind of go, I want to make money, I want to be successful financially, and Wall Street has this path of, whatever Wall Street is, where you make $4 million a year and whatever. But geez, Mark Zuckerberg seems pretty rich. I think I'm Mark Zuckerberg. Where do you kind of point your wagon as you head out?
I mean, I can tell you just from anecdotal and internet-based evidence, which who knows what that really means. I've seen a lot more people. It used to be that you get out of one of the premier business schools, whether it's Wharton or whatnot or Sloan, and then you go to Wall Street. Yeah, that's the way you make your. That's the way you make your money. Early in your career.
I went to Kellogg, and it was consulting was the other one you'd go into, like McKinsey, Bain.
Exactly, and that's the way you sort of make your money and make your bones in your early years. There's a lot more draw to Silicon Valley because the potential sort of casino upside of working at some random startup that's associated with photo sharing. The next thing you know, it gets acquired by Facebook, and there's only 30 employees, and it was $1 billion in. Yeah. So even the guy who was doing QA and frontline support gets $6 million.
Right.
Who knows? But it's completely casino based.
Yeah.
It's not real.
And it is that scam, right? I mean, I think to a degree that I think maybe Wall Street is not. I think Silicon Valley is that. So is Hollywood.
Yeah.
It is that. Like at Wall Street, if you go there, it's a shitty job and you get paid a ton of money. Or you love, if you're trading,
you grind.
People love it.
You grind. Yeah.
And you get paid a lot of money. But in Silicon Valley, it's sort of like you get this vast set of people working for, not a lot by any standard, but not a lot compared to Wall Street.
You get paid dog shit.
Yeah.
You get, compared to the cost of living here, which is now currently outrageous, you're getting paid probably a third or a fourth of what your contemporaries would be getting paid on Wall Street, and you're paying 50% of that in rent at the very least. But thank God you have a ping pong table and free lunch.
Right. And so and
you don't have to wear a suit.
Right. And mathematically, your odds of one of these companies working. I mean, this is. Look, law firms are based on this, right? Everyone thinks they're going to be a partner. 1 out of 10 people is, right? Or whatever the numbers are. I'd love to know what the odds are in Silicon Valley. I think people think there's like a 50-50 shot I'm going to be, at a company that goes somewhere. And I think the odds like 1 in 1,000, 100.
I would go. I think that obviously it's all in the definition of goes somewhere.
Yeah.
But I think that the numbers are pretty straightforward. I think it's at the very least 10,000 companies are sort of germinating in Silicon Valley at any one time. The likelihood of those companies getting anywhere is, and these are real companies. These are people who have actually filed corporate paperwork. Yeah. They sort of digitally exist as opposed to an idea on a napkin with a few people.
Yeah.
Like those numbers are hundreds of thousands probably.
Yeah.
Of those tens of thousands, probably more than tens of thousands because these numbers are pretty old in my head.
Yeah.
Maybe 10% actually get to another stage of commercialization,
right.
whether it's prototype or a few customers or a little funding, and then once you get to venture funding, you've sought it in a tenth again.
Yeah,
and then you get to the very end of the food chain where the company actually exits and people get real money, not sort of fire sale money.
Right,
and those numbers drop to pretty small numbers. Now, admittedly, if you're experienced, you can navigate the waters much more successfully.
Right.
I remember when I sold my last company in 2011, Topic Marks. It was a challenge. It was a good company, excellent technology, excellent team. We had a challenge with finding a good product market fit. It was a summarization technology that would take any document up to 120 pages and make instant cliff notes.
Yep.
It was great. It was wonderful technology. The guys who built it are amazing. And they're all at really good places right now, which is nice. But we sold the company, and it was a challenge because we were getting in there and trying to do the deal, and it had a lot to do with our network.
Right.
and our investors and getting the deal done, which ended up working out well for everybody. I was very pleased with the outcome ultimately, but at the same time, it wasn't Instagram. And it wasn't. I mean, we were in the same co-working space with Instagram and TaskRabbit and GetAround. So we were sort of in the thick of it.
Yeah.
And you look at the successes of it, but there's other ones that are, still sort of in the middle. TaskRabbit is a perfect example.
Yeah.
They were doing very well, and they were sort of the darling. And
they missed they're one of the ones that just missed it by so many things in Silicon Valley are like, you got the right idea, but you're off. There was a company called InCircle that I take back that might not be the right name, but it started same time as Facebook. Started at Stanford. Exactly the same thing happened happened at Harvard. Took over the campus. 90% of people were on it within 48 hours. It's like, this is great. Mm-hmm. We're going to make this a software package that we take to universities and sell. And you're not using InCircle anymore. And TaskRabbit had this idea about the sort of mesh economy. You could get anybody to do anything for you. But I think they ran into the problem of too much choice. Like, people don't know what you're supposed to. Whereas Uber's like, call a car.
Yeah.
And you're like, I know what to do with Uber.
Yeah, I press this magic button and a car shows up. Yeah. And then there's just choices about what car.
Yeah. So if it's like, if you could have any person do anything you want, you're like, I don't know. But Caviar, the rest is like, do you want to order food? That's us. All right, we'll pause it there. We'll be back next week to finish my conversation with Peter Berger. This has been the Something Ventured podcast. Thanks so much for listening.